Am I live? I think I am. All right. I'm going live from my phone on this channel. I started to read the bunny book, but I don't want to do it on this channel. I want to keep it on the same channel. So we're getting back to chapter 4 because why? I got time for it. When I got time to read, I try to take strict advantage of it. But they jacked me up today. All right, so we're going to chapter 4. Weave among the pines like a tomboy. Wonder what that means. May 1980. Patches, a wiggly orange and white Brittany Spaniel puppy, arrived on Mother's Day when I was near the age of 2. She followed my dad all over our yard with me trailing right behind, and Dad would work to keep us both out of trouble. He'd lift me up, dust off my knees, and brush my face with his dark mustache, making me squeal, "Daddy, you're bristly." In the mornings, I'd stand in our hallway peering into the bathroom, watching Dad shave off his overnight whiskers. Sometimes, seemingly abruptly, he would shave off his mustache or grow out his beard, and when I was very little, I'd wonder where my father had gone. When Dad's eyes were the color of grass in the spring, it was easy to tuck up next to him while he answered my myriad questions. But as early as I can remember, being around Dad could be complicated. When his eyes turned dark, stormy like the unsettled sea, it was wise to stay clear till he was himself again. It could be hard to know who was coming home at 6 o'clock, who was driving up in the white van with the red ladders and the letters ADT on the side. When Dad was gruff and sullen, it was best to have your shoes put away and to mind your P's and Q's. After my dad's arrest, my mom said, "Near Dad, it could often feel like we had to walk on eggshells." Mom knew how to gently send Dad along, saying, "I'll clean up dinner. Why don't you go take care of the outside chores? Maybe Patches would like to go on a walk. Weather looks nice this weekend. Might be a good time to fish." I learned at an early age that if you could get Dad outside, his shoulders would straighten, the haunted look in his eyes would fade, and he would just be Dad again. And when I was around the age of 3, Dad temporarily turned my corner bedroom into a greenhouse. Over the winter, I helped Dad pick out seeds from the Burpees catalog, and in the spring, he set mint green trays with speckled soil under the fluorescent lights in my room. He rigged smaller lights in the attached shed where I stood on my tiptoes on his small wooden ladder, peering into the trays to see what had sprung to life. As Dad's garden continued to expand in one corner of our yard, he drew up blueprints for a treehouse in the opposite corner. On top of 4 redwood poles, a wooden platform slowly emerged, and we as kids dangled our feet off of it as Dad added walls and windows. Once it was tall enough for even Dad to stand in, he topped it with a slanted shingle roof, propped a tall wooden ladder in the doorway, and turned it over to my brother and me. I often tagged along with Dad on Saturday mornings to payless cashways, wandering up and down the aisles of tools, gadgets, and good-smelling lumber. Dad would select what he needed, lay it on the back of the car, and tie a red warning flag off the end. We'd drive home and get to work. May 1982. When I was almost 4, my dad's parents, Grandpa Bill and Grandma Dorothea, arrived at our home towing a small yellow and white trailer with their large gold Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. We loaded the car up in the faint gray pre-dawn light and headed south. In Texas, we stopped at Goose Island State Park to visit the big tree, a massive oak whose arms twisted to the sky, and tossed a bit of Grandma's Chex Mix up to the swirling gulls. We crossed over to Padre Island via a ferry at Port Arkansas and spent the next several days parked right up next to the beach. Dad carved a large birthday card for Mom in the sand and helped us kids build elaborate castles, finding the just right shells to decorate our fleeting dwellings with. I squealed as the tide came in and broke apart our creations, carrying them back to the ocean. Dad inadvertently ran into a Portuguese man of war one morning in the surf and came back to the trailer, jumping and yelling, with a bright purple angry mark stretched over his foot. Dad's hooting and hollering gave me the giggles. The seashore cemented in my heart on that magical trip, but I was so young that as I grew up, I'd ask Mom again and again, did we really visit the big tree, feed the gulls, and stay on the beach for days? She would say, don't you remember? While my brother was in school, I'd tag along with Mom to church where she worked as a part-time secretary. Sometimes we would run into Grandpa Bill, who would wave as he drove a riding lawnmower over 4 acres that jutted up against fields. I liked playing out back near the white shed. There was often a horse to pet carefully over the barbed wire fence and an old pile of boards to get into trouble on. On Sundays, Mom sang in the choir and Dad ushered. While my parents were busy during the service, my brother and I sat next to my grandparents in a wooden pew. I often sat between my grandmas, fidgeting in frilly dresses with lace petticoats, scuffing my black patent Mary Janes on the tile. Grandma Doretha's offer of yellow wrapped juicy fruit gum and Grandma Eileen's offer of green Echo Hills golf pencils to doodle with on the bulletin usually kept me busy. Granddad Palmer helped by giving me the giggles, and Grandpa Bill sometimes offered to take us all out for lunch at Fur's cafeteria afterward. Sunday after Sunday, I wistfully daydreamed as I stared out the stained glass windows, wishing I could weave through the towering pine trees swaying in the wind. But if I fidgeted too much or caused a disturbance, Dad will haul me out of church, and I'd get stuck sitting in our tan two-door hatchback Chevy with its sticky, too hot in the summer leather seats. Dad would loosen his tie and with his sleeves rolled up, prop up his arm on the open windowsill and read the thick Sunday edition of his beloved Eagle. If he wasn't fuming too much, I'd gone out. If he wasn't fidgeting too much, if I'd gone out in his arms willingly, not kicking and screaming, Dad would pass me the comics with a grin or let me run around the ground zigzagging through the pines, kicking up needles, no matter how I might scuff up my fancy shoes, tear my tights, or dirty up my nice dress. Mom would shake her head and ask, can you at least act like a lady on Sundays? I'd simply reply, nope. And Dad would say with pride, that's my tomboy. Dad committed murder 3 more times after I was born. Even now, it's not possible to reconcile the man and life I knew with the other man and his other life. After his arrest, Dad talked about his ability to compartmentalize his two sides. It was his way of separating the dark from the light. Since his arrest, I've fought to hold on to the man I knew and the places we loved. But the truth is, he continued to inflict devastation, taking other lives and ruining more families while living with and caring for his own family. Dad murdered Maureen Hedge, a grandmother and widow, at the end of April 1985. She lived down the street from us, and Mom and I would wave hello to her on our way to my grandparents'. Mrs. Hedge went missing on a stormy night. When I heard the police were searching for her, I felt scared. I was 6 years old, and only Mom and I had been home that night. How did I know if we were safe? A few days later, a police officer walked up our driveway. He was out canvassing the neighborhood and stopped to ask Mom some questions. I grew even more frightened when they found Mrs. Hedges' body in the country a week later. She had been strangled. I don't know how I knew this at my young age other than overhearing the TV news or my folks talking. At the time, Dad had reassured me, don't worry, we're safe. A few weeks after Mrs. Hedges' body was found, I was climbing the huge pines at church and Mom yelled, "Get down before you break an arm." Minutes later, running inside, I fell and broke my arm. Dad rushed to my side, rigged up a splint, and placed me in the back of our new silver Oldsmobile station wagon. He drove me to Wesley, where I had surgery on a compound fracture of the elbow. Doctors put my bones back together with pins and placed my arm in a split cast. Due to complications, I ended up staying 5 days in the hospital. Mom rarely left my side. Because my injury was so severe, I wasn't able to finish first grade and we weren't able to go on vacation to Padre Island. I felt awful about missing the beach, and I could tell Dad was disappointed. He was really looking forward to our trip. My young mind tied everything together: the shock of my broken arm, my guilt over our canceled vacation, and my fear when learning that our neighbor who had gone missing was found murdered. It would be 30 years before I fully faced these events, attempted to understand their traumatic impact, and began to recover. Best I can figure, my night terrors began around this time. When Mom heard me scream, she would quickly come to my side, sit on the edge of my bed, and try to soothe me back to sleep. Half awake, I'd often argue with her, sometimes belligerently, saying, "There's a bad man in the house, in my room." Y'all, I'm pausing because that is real. I've had an experience like that. I really have. You know, when you're asleep, I think you're vulnerable to a lot of stuff and probably sensitive, maybe somewhat. And I've had a similar experience. At 19, I remember someone saying to me, "You were whimpering and crying in your sleep." And that happened often. And I'd be like, "Really?" And I vaguely can recall me whimpering and like crying and sobbing as I was sleeping. And there certainly was a reason for that. You know, subconsciously as you're sleeping, you're picking up things. For sure. And when you are sleeping next to evil, or evil is present in the house, when you're sleeping, you can pick that up. So I get what she just said. I so get that. She would gently reassure me, no, you're dreaming. You're safe. Go back to sleep. I drift back off because my mom was right there and my dad was right across the hall. And he'd never, ever let anyone or anything hurt us. That summer, because we weren't able to go to the beach, my mom and her sister, my Aunt Sharon, took the kids to Fantasy in Wichita. My cousin Michelle was 9 and I was 7, and we were quite the sight. She had jumped out of a swing and broken both her wrists around the same time I broke my arm. With plastic bags around our casts, we stood under a waterfall that day, our hair pulled back in ponytails, grinning as we watched our older blonde-headed siblings tackle the water slides. Michelle's older sister, Andrea, and I would later shake our heads and laugh about our mom's attempt at adventure. That afternoon, Mom and I were out on a raft in a wave pool when a wave came up and tipped us, causing me to fall overboard. As I sank, partly weighted down by my cast, Mom firmly grabbed my good arm and brought me back up. A lifeguard had been ready to jump in and save me, but Mom had me, no problem. Chapter 5, Go Comet Hunting in the Winter. August 1985. In 1985, after 37 years with Kansas Gas and Electric, Grandpa Bill retired as a plant operator with a steady pension and a gold watch. He took the cousins on a tour of his plant once, and I remember being in awe of the massive generators he had worked around for decades. Grandma Dorothea joined him in retirement after 25 years with Leakers. Mom had worked alongside my grandma as a bookkeeper for a few years before she accepted a job with Snacks convenience store. I liked visiting them in their wood-paneled office, watching long, thin strips of white paper curl as their fingers flew on their adding machines. After my grandparents retired, my brother and I and my cousins, Lacey and her younger sister Sarah, sometimes stayed for days at a time with them. We were known to wreak havoc and were often sent downstairs to the wood-paneled family room or outside to run amok. We liked playing hide and seek downstairs. The unfinished part of the basement was a great place to hide. Outside, you could crouch down behind the garden tools in the old white shed that smelled of machine oil and dirt. In the evenings with Grandma, we would watch old black and white movies with smartly dressed, mouthy heroines who solved mysteries. We also played Uno at the dining table while passing around popcorn and drinking RC Cola. Grandpa would accuse us kids of holding a pick four card up our sleeves. We'd shake our arms and say, "Nothing's here, dude." He'd raise one eyebrow and chuckle. We girls, who shared the same color hair and eyes, sometimes slept in my grandparents' king bed in our dad's old bedroom. Photos of my dad and uncles rested on a white shelf above my grandparents' bed, and we giggled over what they used to look like. I'd drift off to sleep, listening to the wind chimes that hung on the back porch, gently sounding with the breeze. In February 1986, I stayed up all night comet hunting, alongside Grandpa Bill, Dad, and Brian, parked on a dirt road. We were some of the lucky ones to finally catch a glimpse of Halley's Comet in the bone-chilling, hazy blue-gray dawn. It passed by quickly, and I wasn't even sure I'd seen it. But the guys all agreed the slight, fast-moving round object streaked across the sky was indeed Halley. After it went by, as the sun was beginning to show, Grandpa said, "Well, that was something. Now who's hungry?" And he proceeded to take us out to breakfast of biscuits and gravy at Grandy's. August 1986. Dad was a blast to adventure with. splashing cannonballs in motel pools, running down sand dunes in thunderstorms, and yelling right alongside us on Space Mountain. But in August 1986, while we were vacationing in Southern California, my dad flipped out early one evening. Noticing dusty footprints on top of a van parked under our motel balcony, he was convinced someone had climbed onto the van and broken into our room while we were gone. I'd never seen him that on edge before, bug-eyed and sweaty, pacing back and forth, ranting like a lunatic. He even made our family use a password to answer the door, even though he was the only one coming and going with bags from the car. I learned how to navigate around my dad during these trickier times by watching my mom. It was best to go along with him. He'd settle down soon enough. Despite my dad's irrational behavior that night, we had an unforgettable vacation. One thing about sociopaths, they will do shit to people. And I mean, forever. They'll be involved in doing some effed up stuff to people for all of time. And if there is even a hint of someone doing the same thing that he's been doing to other people, they fucking flip and lose it. That mask comes down, comes off, and they start tripping out. How highly offended and angry they become when someone does what they've been doing to other people. Despite my dad's irrational behavior that night, we had an unforgettable vacation. We stopped at sites along our route between Kansas and the Pacific Ocean. In California, we went to SeaWorld and the San Diego Zoo, and we spent 3 magical days at Disneyland. When school started in August, I brought in photos of my vacation, and my third grade teacher attached them to a bulletin board. I can tell you all about our trip, and I can describe my classroom in detail. What I can't tell you is why, only a month after our return, Dad murdered Vicki Wegerly, a mother of 2 children. Mrs. Wegerly lived near the Sweetbriar area where my dad and brother went to the barber, around the corner from the library where I spent hours perusing the bookshelves. I can't fully separate out that time period in my life now. I have my memories, and now I know the truth. Wow. I'll probably be pausing often while reading this book and sipping on Long Island iced tea because this is just 2 different individuals in one body. Does he have MPD, multiple personality disorder? Well, 2 isn't exactly multiple, right? Is there a difference between MPD and what's going on with Dennis Rader? There's Dennis Rader, the loving dad, the husband, family vacations, loving his tomboy little girl, and all of this that we're seeing, usher at the church. And then there's BTK. I'm just trying to process this and figure this shit out. July 1988. My family continued to attend church almost every week, and around the age of 10, I served as an acolyte. Around that same time, I have no idea what an acolyte is, and my internet is down, which is why I'm reading from the phone. It won't be back up till another 5 hours, according to AT&T, and I can't look it up on my phone because I'm live on my phone. I hate coming across a word. Hold on. I always gotta look things up on the phone. Don't I have a, you know what? I packed up a whole bunch of books and put them in the box, which included a dictionary. And the reason why I packed up a dictionary book is because who uses dictionaries anymore? But I really need one right now. All right. I don't know what an acolyte is. I'll look it up later. Ah, lost my place. Oh, around the same time, Dad served occasionally as an assistant to the pastor, donning a robe and a colorful vestment, doing his best to chant his way through the Apostles' Creed. Dad and I would sit across from each other when we served together, occasionally catching each other's eyes and silently communicating. I blame Mom for this. I'd rather be fishing. When Dad was laid off from his job at ADT in July, he became dejected. I remember him opening the kitchen door while holding a tight piece of paper and asking Mom to step outside. When they came back in, Mom looked worried. Dad had drawn up plans to add on to our home, but those plans were set aside that day and never picked up again. Dad found a temporary job with the 1990 census, but it required long business trips. He was often gone for days at a time, traveling around Kansas, but also in Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. I missed him and was glad when he was home. We went on long walks with Patches, stayed up late watching scary movies after Mom went to bed, and shared paperback mysteries. One's Mom didn't necessarily approve of me reading. So, as we speak, BTK has left breadcrumbs that he had, you know, murdered at least two women. Two women is cold cases, one in Missouri and one in Oklahoma. And one was done in 1976 and one was done in 1990. I don't know which year, whether it was 1976 Missouri and 1990 Oklahoma or vice versa. But he was in Oklahoma or Missouri for that 1990 case. And it's so serious that Kerri just recently visited her father trying to get information about these cases, just trying to bring closure to the family. I think one person was found and one person has never been found. And so he's playing cat and mouse because he's jealous of the attention that Rex Heuermann is getting, and as well as Brian Koberger. Wow. Dad was later put in charge. What the hell? He was later put in charge of a large office floor of workers downtown across from the main library branch, one of our favorite places to hang out. I found his temporary office fascinating with its portable cardboard desks and high up important view. And I remember him closing the office for the last time, hauling our boxes of supplies and saying the census was over and the government didn't need any of this stuff. That winter was terrible for my family. Mom fell ill in December, spending 12 days in the hospital with pneumonia. Dad tried his best to take care of us kids and the house, though he backed the Oldsmobile into our neighbor's car on our way to see Mom at St. Francis. I ended up with a D in English, even though I'd always been a good student, but I'd never seen Mom ill for more than a day or two. My relationship with Dad seemed to be fraying at times. It felt as if he was pushing me away. He was preoccupied and moody. Life felt unstable, and I was fearful our family would crack under the stress. In January 1991, Dad murdered Dolores Davis, a mother and grandmother who lived a few miles east of us. In the spring of 1991, Dad took up the hobby of stamp collecting. He often spread them all over the kitchen table while Mom was at choir practice. I'd already learned it was better to leave Dad to his own devices. If he was content, he caused less grief in the house, and I was in less trouble, owing fewer quarters to the swear jar. In April, Dad finally found a new job as a Park City compliance officer. His office was in the same building as the police station, just down the hall. He wore a brown uniform, decked to the nines, similar in appearance to a county sheriff's, even including the gold badge over his heart. In his element, he drove around neighborhoods in a marked truck and had an excuse to snoop in other people's yards. He was happier employed, and life at home settled for all of us. My father murdered 4 members of the Otero family in the winter of 1974, and 17 years later, he murdered Mrs. Davis. He was unemployed both times and stated after he was arrested that he was in similar downtrodden states. I knew when I was 12 Dad wasn't well, but I never would have thought he could commit murder. Lots of people lose their jobs, experience loved ones becoming ill, go through seasonal ups and downs, or battle mental illness, yet they never cause harm. My father took care of Brian and me, cooking us odd-looking eggs for breakfast when my mom was in the hospital, and then, a month later, murdered a grandmother. It is truly insane. Then, what my father did, taking 10 lives over 17 years, and then living the next 14 as if he hadn't. Chapter 6. Excuse me. Have adventures because life is fragile. August 1991, Colorado. Grandpa Bill and Grandma Dorothea took Brian, Lacey, Sarah, and me to Woodland Park, northwest of Colorado Springs, in August 1991. We towed a long brown and white trailer behind the Suburban. My grandma gave us strict orders that all of our clothes for the week needed to fit in one sturdy tomato box per grandchild, and we could do laundry at the KOA. In Colorado, we went trout fishing in a bright blue lake set high in the Rockies. I was always thrilled and tickled that my grandma fished and drank beer out of a can. While riding horses through the red rocks of the Garden of the Gods, Grandma uttered she was getting too old for this sort of thing, while Grandpa chuckled and sang, "Whoopee-tee-yi-yo, get along, little doggies." My parents drove out the next weekend and picked us kids up while my grandparents stayed on for weeks more, likely glad to have peace and quiet restored. 3 years later, Grandpa Bill fell ill in Colorado Springs with leukemia. Dad and Uncle Bill drove to the mountains to be with my grandparents and towed the trailer back. After that, it became routine to visit Grandpa in St. Francis's cancer wing. At first, I was nervous about visiting the hospital, but Grandpa took it all in stride, and his calm acceptance helped the rest of us cope. On our way to the hospital, we'd offer to bring him something decent from a favorite place like Long John Silver's or Brahms, but he usually declined. Mom would fetch him Ensure shakes and crushed ice and sit by his bedside while Dad and I took Grandma to dinner. Grandpa always had a couple of paperbacks stacked on his hospital tray, often from Michener or Lamore, and he would talk books. Grandpa, Dad, and me. Sometimes Dad would stay the night, but he always made sure to walk us girls to our cars before returning to Grandpa. Walk the girls to their cars, make sure they're safe. Weird shit, man. That's all I can say. Weird shit. March 1995, Texas. In March 1995, Dad and I set out on a late Friday afternoon with Brian and my cousin A.D., who was 2 years younger than me, for a week-long camping trip on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. During the drive, the boys conked out in the dark brown Suburban we had borrowed from Grandpa Bill, but I'd stayed awake to keep my dad company as we headed to Dalhart, Texas for the night. We drove through the panhandle, eating Cheez-Its and marveling at the blinking irrigation lights out in the fields. They looked otherworldly. The next day, Dad and I talked for hours while driving across New Mexico, taking in the stark red-orange mazes that rose on the edge of the rolling yellows and greens of the plains. I was 16 years old, a junior at Wichita Heights High School, where I switched between honors classes every 15 minutes. After school, I played golf in the fall and ran track in the spring. Some Saturdays, I would compete with my Scholars Bowl team, and on Sundays, I worked an afternoon shift, often by myself at Snacks. Heading along I-40 that afternoon, the four of us listened to the trucker line over Grandpa's CB radio and created our own handles as we said things like breaker breaker. The highway ran parallel in place to old Route 66, and Dad regaled us with tales of the trip he'd taken to California in the mid-1950s with his folks and brothers. After a long day of driving, we arrived the second night at a roadside motel in Flagstaff that was set alongside railroad tracks. Not long after we'd fallen asleep, a train went barreling by. I sat straight up in bed and screamed, waking up the boys who were in sleeping bags on the floor. I looked over and saw my dad's maps and a current National Geographic magazine laid out on a small table near the window, illuminated by a hazy yellow streetlight. Though my mom was the one who usually calmed me down at night, Dad was able to put me at ease, saying, "Kerri, it's okay. It's just a train. Nothing to be scared of. They're going to be running all night. Hear the rattles and rumbles on the tracks? It's a good sound to sleep by." The next morning, we drove to the canyon and set up our tents in a campground surrounded by towering pines near the south rim. The boys and I tossed a football under the aromatic trees, needles crunching as I hurried to catch their throws. A good climbing tree was in our camp, and each of us kids tried it during the week. We spent the next 4 days exploring, covering a good expanse of the Rim Trail and hiking down the Bright Angel and Bab trails. The canyon was a daytime oasis of warmth and color, showing signs of the coming summer. The rim was awash in early spring coolness, still hanging on to winter. As at night, I tucked myself into my sleeping bag and rolled up against my dad, trying to stay warm in our forest green two-man tent. Our breath froze overnight, crystallizing on the blankets we'd thrown over ourselves. Ice pelleted our ponchos one evening as Dad and I walked down to the payphone to call and check in with Mom. We'd been quite cold, freezing in the desert, but even with the rougher conditions for camping, we'd caught the hiking bug. The last trail we went down was Hermit. While eating lunch in Walden Basin, a mile and a half below the rim, the vastness of the canyon called to us. Majestic expanses, rising high, were just out of our reach for a day trip. We vowed to each other then we would return. When I got back home, I quit track. I was suffering from shin splints, and the steep trails in the canyon had aggravated them. Leaving track meant I could go straight home from school and crash on the couch before tackling homework. I expected a lecture for quitting, worried Dad would be disappointed in me, but he just shrugged and said, "That's all right, kiddo. Your studies are more important." Not long after we got back, Dad started planning our next trip, researching camping overnight below the rim, and then a whole heck of a lot of life, the hard, unexpected kind, happened. Back then, I figured I was going through the worst days I would ever see. Chapter 7. Allow yourself to grieve. August 1996, Wichita. On a Wednesday afternoon in August 1996, I was working one of my last days at Snacks when I felt a sudden sharp stab in my chest. Pressing down on the pain with my hand, I turned toward my mom, who was sitting feet away in her tiny office, and said, "Mama, my heart hurts. Something's wrong." Grandma Eileen's heart had taken on a similar ailing, and late that evening, she called to tell us Aunt Sharon's family had been in an accident out in Colorado where they were vacationing. Mom and I, concerned, hurried down the street to her parents' house where we found Grandma Eileen and Granddad Palmer in the dining room waiting for a phone call. Grandma sat with her fingers interlaced around a cup of coffee. Her cloudy blue eyes, tucked behind light brown frames, searched into the space around us, landing on our worried faces. Granddad, who still had a head full of hair I thought made him look boyish even though it was silver gray, was sitting ramrod straight in a sleeveless white undershirt. It was hard to see him quiet, pained. He often joshed around, full of life. I curled up on the floor next to my mom and pressed my head into her side when the phone rang. My mom answered, speaking to Andrea. I caught it in Mom's voice, breaking high. "Oh, what, honey?" Michelle had died. I crumbled over, screeching out in pain. Andrea, age 22, told us they were jeeping when a rain-soaked narrow road gave way under their jeep, which rolled down into a deep ravine. And Andrea, injured, climbed out and hiked for help along the road. And they were in such a remote location that it took hours for rescue crews to reach them. Uncle Bob, also injured, did what he could for 20 year old Michelle, whose injuries were fatal, and for Aunt Sharon, who'd been airlifted to a nearby hospital and was fighting for her life. Grandma turned pale, her hands shaking as she grasped my mom's arm, and Granddad hunched over, putting his hands on his knees, anguished by the loss of his granddaughter, fearful for the life of his daughter. And when Dad came through the front door, I got to my feet and rounded the hallway corner, standing in my parents' living room. Dad's eyes shrouded in gray, his face darkened, and his countenance broke. I rushed into his arms so grieved I could barely stand. I'd never seen the men I loved ever look that way, and I didn't know what to do about it. My heart bottomed out. The night we lost Michelle was one of the worst nights of my life. Michelle died in an accident, but after my father's arrest, after I learned about his murders, I grieved the sudden, irreplaceable losses that 7 families had to go through because of my father. That night, Dad had walked down to my grandparents, right by Mrs. Hedges' old house. It's still not fully possible for me to reckon these two sides of the same man. I was just trying to process that myself a little while ago. Back home, I found Michelle's high school senior photo from 2 years before. She was grinning, her bright blue eyes twinkling, her long light brown hair streaked with sun. An abundance of yellow poppies surrounded her under a piercing blue Kansas sky. I ran my thumb across the photo and placed it in a small light blue frame, sitting it on my desk. I dug around in my desk drawer for a small inspirational book given to me at graduation. It had several Bible verses in it, and flipping through them offered the first small piece of solace. I set it next to Michelle's picture, along with a small wooden angel with twisted metal wings. Mom came in and sat on the corner of my bed, gently brushing my hair away from my face. We talked softly late into the night, sharing stories about the girl we loved till I fell asleep. The next morning, there were a few seconds when I didn't remember what had happened. The pain came rushing back to my chest and I cried out. Coming to my side, Mom stroked my hair again as the dark waves hit. She told me the doctors were able to save my aunt's badly fractured leg and foot in a complicated surgery, and she was now recovering in the ICU from several injuries. It would be some time before she was well enough to travel home to Wichita, so my grandparents were packing to drive out to Colorado to help. Later that morning, I sat on the couch with my knees tucked under me while Pastor Sally from our church tried to offer comfort. I was wearing an old t-shirt and baggy pants I'd slept in and picking at a lemon poppy seed muffin. I felt my anger rising. I was having none of it. I didn't want platitudes. I didn't want to hear about God. Michelle was gone. It's getting dark. I need to turn on another light. Give me a second. My faith began to wane in September 1992, a month into my freshman year, when 2 boys died after their pickup truck rolled a block from school. That fall, I sat down with Pastor Sally, whom I'd taken confirmation classes with. I told her I couldn't reconcile what happened down the street with God, who I wasn't even sure existed. My heart was hardening, but Mom ignored it, insisting I wear a white dress and take an oath of confirmation. In November 1992, I stood up in front of my family and congregation, appearing obedient, hiding a growing defiance in my soul. No one seemed fazed by my choice of scripture to read. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Even conversations with my family about the Bible were frowned upon. Hmm. One Sunday, while turning out of the church parking lot, I brought up the sermon, but straight laced dad quietly shut it down, declaring curtly, "We don't talk about religion, sex, or politics." In April 1995, two men blew up the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, a few hours south of Wichita, killing 168 people, including 19 children. For the next several days, my family and I watched national news coverage of the recovery efforts. Where was God then? Where is God now? Mm. Well, mm, I'm sure she believes in God today after finding out her daddy is a devil. Because you know, if the devil is real, you'd be a fool not to think God is real. Only when you have witnessed, interacted, or recognized evil up front and close and personal, if that does not make you acknowledge God, I don't know what will. After the pastor left, the phone kept ringing. It echoed from the kitchen and my parents' bedroom, followed by mom's voice catching. I told her, I've had enough, and headed to my best friend Rita's house. We had grown close over the past few years in high school, surviving advanced placement classes during the week and catching the latest blockbusters at the movie theater on the weekend. She greeted me at her door with a big hug, her normally bright blue eyes darkened with concern. I hid out at her home the rest of the day watching movies and talking about leaving for Kansas State University soon. We were going to be roommates. I was fighting to numb the sorrow that kept catching in my throat. I'd be able to go a stretch without crying, and then stinging pain would come back and I'd weep again. I was embarrassed by my swollen red eyes and face at dinner that night with her family, but thankful to be included. I didn't want to leave the warmth around their dining table and go back to my house, tight with grief. 4 days after the accident, I unfolded our thick Sunday Eagle and saw an article about it on the front page. It was surreal to read about those I loved in peril in the mountains. Later, I carefully folded the paper and tucked it away to keep. I spent the next week packing for college in a blur, and on a Friday morning, after Dad and Brian stacked the back of my grandpa's Suburban full, my family set off on a 2-hour drive to Manhattan, Kansas. We stood in line at the old Kansas State Gymnasium to finish my registration, where my first student loan check was handed to me. Rita and I were living in Boyd Hall, an all-girls residence beautifully crafted out of limestone in 1951. Our dorm room was in a sizable corner with a lofted ceiling. It had a good view of Quinlan Natural Area, which sat across a circle drive. On Sunday, standing in my doorway, my mom was in tears as she said goodbye. She and I had been at odds that morning, and now we were parting ways roughly. I was likely being difficult because it was easier to push her away than be sad over her leaving me. It didn't strike me till later how hard it must have been for her to let me go. I was on the pre-vet track, hoping to make it into veterinary school in 2 years, scrambling between the massive limestone buildings on campus, collecting a pile of syllabi, and I began to wonder how I'd keep up with my 16-hour credit load. It seemed like a reasonable number of courses when I enrolled a few months before, and after sitting down with my advisor for a few minutes, she said, "You seem very capable," as she signed off on my slip, a long line of students waiting behind me. The first week of college passed by quickly as I spent time hanging out with old friends and making new ones. And on Friday afternoon, I loaded up a basket of laundry, textbooks, black shoes, and dress clothes, and headed home for a long Labor Day weekend. We were having Michelle's memorial on Monday. I knew I needed to be there and wanted to be with my family, but I was dreading facing it too. For dinner Friday evening, Mom made cheese manicotti, a favorite of our family, putting in a good deal of effort after working all day. I was glad to be home, but when the four of us sat down, tensions from the past weeks boiled over, landing us in an argument. Someone pounded on our old rickety brown table. One of the metal legs popped out, and the table and all its dishes crashed down. My dad, red-faced, wound tight, leaped up from his chair full of rage. Standing in the middle of broken plates, tomato sauce, and noodles, he lunged at my brother. Facing him, putting his hands around his neck, Dad began to choke him. Dad's eyes and face were blazing, close to manic. My brother, terrified, turned white, yelling. Mom and I pushed at Dad and were able to break it up. Dad stepped back and shook his head, and as his eyes began to clear, his shoulders slumped, and with his head down, he said, heck, let's get this mess cleaned up. With a flash of anger in her eyes and firmness in her voice, Mom said, "We'll handle it. You go outside." While helping Mom pick up broken pieces of plates and glasses, I glanced at her with uncertainty, my face questioning what had just happened. As she cleaned the floor, she had tears in her eyes. With weariness in her voice, she said, "You haven't been here this past week. It's been a lot. You've been gone." Dad's temper was unpredictable. He threatened us kids before, but had never physically hurt us, let alone tried to strangle one of us. All families get into arguments, but what my father did was inexcusable. Yet at the time, we dismissed it. It'd been that way as long as I could recall. Dad is under a lot of stress. He just lost control. He didn't mean it. He will apologize soon. On the exterior, our family looked like the American dream, and I'd grown up believing that very thing. I tucked away, deep within me, this outburst of my father's, telling no one till he was arrested. What would have happened if we called the police that night? Would they have done anything? Would they have questioned him enough to find decades-long terror hiding behind his rage? These questions still haunt me. Chapter 8. Attempt to outrun what haunts you. September 1996. 3 days later, my family dressed up and quietly drove to Michelle's memorial. It was held downtown at the Wichita Boathouse, where Michelle had taught kids to row that past summer along the banks of the Arkansas River. My heart lifted when I saw my grandparents arrive in the family room before the service. I was glad to stand close to Grandma Dorothea, her warm brown eyes looking into mine with concern while holding my hands between hers. It was good to give Grandpa Bill, taller than any of us at 6'1", a big hug, to have his kind, reassuring presence there. Grandpa's battle with leukemia had taken his hair, but not his inner fortitude. A man of steady faith, I'd never heard him complain once about what he was enduring. Just by being there, he was telling us we'd get through. How could we have known my high school graduation party 3 months ago would be the last time we would all be together? We had a house full gathered around folding tables set up in our living room, just as we always did. And there was a heap of food and dessert. It was Mom's chocolate sheet cake with homemade ice cream churned out on the patio by Dad. We 6 cousins on Mom's side, including 80's older brother Jason, had our picture taken in my family's front yard that day. We were full of smiles, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of our tall pine tree and swaying pampas grass. The memorial service was held in a large open room packed with people who knew our family. Granddad Palmer kept patting us kids on the shoulders, and Grandma Eileen kept taking our hands. Both of their faces were shadowed with heartbreak. As sunlight poured in from the tall windows that surrounded us, Michelle's testimony was shared. She was a Christian. She had accepted Jesus as her Savior in college the year before. Verses from John were read. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. I heard about God and Jesus for 18 years at our church, but I didn't know them. Not the way Michelle did. 3 weeks before she passed away, I stayed a few days with her while her folks were away on a short trip. She slept upstairs and gave me her bedroom downstairs. Her Bible and other books of faith were stacked next to her bed with prayer notes and bookmarks sticking out. I didn't even know where my Bible was. Late on a Sunday morning, I crawled out of bed and walked into her den. Michelle was sitting cross-legged on the floor in her pink PJs with a bowl of cereal, her hair up in a loose ponytail. The funny papers were spread out next to her. Her 2 schnauzers were lying close by, and the Atlanta Olympics were on in the background. She looked right with the world, and I should have asked then about her stack of books and her Bible, but I didn't. Instead, I joined her with my own bowl of cereal, and we watched rowing, talking about what it might take to get to the 2000 Olympics. And that weekend was the last time I saw her. If I'd only known, I would have stayed several more days and asked her about Jesus. After the service, I hugged Andrea for a long time, her forest green eyes full of heartache. The 2 of us looked hard into each other's faces, trying to reassure the other we were going to be okay. And Aunt Sharon, blonde and petite like Andrea, sat in a wheelchair, holding a basket of flowers in her lap. Her face was weary, but her sea green eyes were determined. She was going to get all of us through this. Uncle Bob, slim, near my height, with brown hair and blue eyes that matched Michelle's, was standing quietly behind the wheelchair, holding on to the handles. He'd steadily reply, "We're hanging in there, doing all right," as folks offered condolences and hugs, trying to reassure others they'd be all right too. On that bright last summer holiday, the 5 remaining cousins walked to a nearby bridge and tossed daisies into the river below. On a cool spring day the year before, I stood on a bridge a few miles north of there in Riverside, cheering for the girl who'd flown down the river with her college crew, running across the bridge as they rode under it. I was able to yell from both sides. And now that girl was gone, and I watched white flowers float slowly south till I couldn't see them anymore. That evening, Rita and I rode back to college with AD and Jason's mom, Aunt Donna. While heading north on Route 77, a 2-lane highway that dips and rises above the western edges of the Flint Hills. I tried to catch a glimpse of the stars through my passenger window. George Strait was singing "Love Without End, Amen" through the tape deck as I placed my head against the cool pane of glass. Would life ever hurt this much again? Back inside my dorm, I felt like I'd aged a decade over the past 4 days. I set my alarm, wondering whose bright idea it was to schedule a class at 7 a.m. or to sign up for it. The next morning, my alarm blared from the edge of my dresser. I sat up, turned in bed, and swatted at the big gray button on top. I'll just hit the snooze once. 8 minutes later, blurry-headed, I reset the alarm for a few hours later. Forget it, I will skip just this once. Right now, you're making the choice to not get up, to screw up. I was able to quiet the small, persistent voice by rolling over to face the wall, putting my comforter up to my chin, and squeezing my eyes shut. Sleep alleviated all worry, all pain, all suffering. It wiped out everything. Instead of beginning to deal with the gaping hole that had been knocked into me, I threw myself into college life. Weekdays were busy with attending classes, having meals at the dining center with a growing group of friends, and attempting to study in the evenings. On home game Saturdays, I stood for hours with Rita in the student section clad in purple, cheering for our Wildcats. Sundays meant sleeping in, playing frisbee golf, and eventually getting around to my textbooks. In early fall, I went with a group of friends to the student union to watch Phenomenon, the last movie I'd seen with Michelle. I'd gone to a theater with my family on the 4th of July and by some quirky chance ended up at the same show as Michelle and her parents. Afterward, our families visited together, standing outside on concrete that sparkled silver under the glowing pink and green neon marquee. A few weeks later, I was with Michelle on our long weekend, and she bought the soundtrack to the movie, which led with Eric Clapton's Change the World. And on that shopping trip, we talked about the main character, a brilliant man who leaves a legacy of love before dying way too young. I cried during the movie in July, and now sitting in the student union, I could barely contain my sorrow, sobbing, wiping my nose and face on my sleeve. I couldn't understand what was wrong. I felt like the walls of the auditorium were closing in as I tried to tuck up my uncooperative body as small as I could, hoping no one would notice me. And after the show was over, we began walking back to our dorms, but I couldn't stop my tears over the seizing in my chest. Not explaining myself, I took off, leaving the group, trying to flee the sharp black pain searing my heart. Why doesn't anyone understand how much this hurts? Over the previous weeks, while walking on campus, I would find something familiar in a walk, a ponytail of light brown hair, or a laugh, and my heart would lift. There's Michelle. She's right here. Then, oh, that can't be her. She's gone. My goodness, she was in such a deep grief. I kept running the day we lost Michelle through my head, picturing jeeps rolling down the sides of mountains, picturing the details of the crash and the terrible hours afterward. I could see it even though I hadn't been there. It was stuck, replaying over and over. How could I tell anyone? They would think I was going crazy. And after I got back to my room, Rita sat up with me till late, listening and offering her calm presence. She told me she'd been praying for me. As I crawled into bed, my face red and tear-stained, I thought more about praying. It sounded comforting, but I was too angry with God. Where was he that afternoon? Why didn't he save her? Michelle believed in him. If anyone were in heaven, she would be. She had to be. I couldn't face it all if she wasn't somewhere. If she was in heaven, then there had to be a heaven. If there was a heaven, then there had to be a God. But I didn't believe God existed anymore. But Michelle, around and around, the wrestling in me circled till I drifted off to sleep. All right. That concludes the second reading. Hello, hello, hello. One person, please come in the chat and say hi. Welcome to this Madam Whip-Ass channel. I don't know who you are, but I do have another channel, Madam Whip-Ass Reads. I just got a strike today. So thus, I'll be reading this book on this Madam Whip-Ass channel. Madam Whip-Ass Reads, I've been reading The Kept Ones by Bunny DeBarge. It's about the DeBarge family. I don't know, you could be someone who's been to the channel before. You can be someone who's never been to the channel. And maybe you know DeBarge, maybe you don't. So, Madam Whip-Ass Reads is my other channel. And feel free to go there and sub. I'm going to stop this reading right here, and I don't know what time it is, but if I have time, and I probably will, I might come back and read some more. I got to do some things, and I got to take a break. Normally, I would play a song. That's what I would do. But, yeah. Can't do that anymore. All right. I may be back. I may not be, but enjoy the readings. Peace.